Hi, hello, this is János. The channel is Shutter and Chill. So today I'm going to elaborate on what is more important to me. What have I experienced? Is it more important to have the latest camera to achieve my freedom of expression, or are skill level and the quality of light more important towards the end result? So those of you who are new to the channel, I am not a professional photographer. I take photos for my own pleasure, and I have been taking them for over 20 years with more than superficial interest. and actually for those of you who know me, but I still have news, and the news is that I think I haven't mentioned before, maybe I did, it's been a while since I made a video, is that I have a 10D, a Canon 10D camera as well. I think I mentioned about it, but I haven't gotten into details. But recently I've been gifted a 5D Mark III as well. I got it from Mike Choi, who is a wonderful photographer friend of mine, and this is just such a wonderful thing. For those of you who are relatively new to Canon camera gear or camera gear in general, or maybe you are not that new and you've been binging on YouTube videos about the latest camera gear like the Canon R5, and you haven't met many photographers yet, our current photographer reality is that a lot of professional photographers today still use the Canon 5D Mark III. And I just talked to one of my photographer friends who is an astonishingly talented, creative, phenomenal photographer, and she has two 5D Mark IIIs that she uses today for her professional work. And she told me that one of them just broke recently, and because there was some liquids splashed on it, and that made one of the buttons tricky, so she replaced it with a 5D Mark IV, and she doesn't like the Mark IV, and she uses mostly the Mark III plus the Mark IV as a backup, but she prefers the Mark III to the Mark IV. And so that's a little bit of story behind it. And now, before I get into exploring the issue of skill level and light versus gear, I want to show you a little bit of this comparison between three cameras. And I picked these three cameras particularly because I own two of them, the 10D and the 5D Mark III. And I also added the R5, which is a modern incarnation of the Canon cameras, and I know that the R5 Mark II just came out, but the ExoMark has measurements for the Mark I, and the Mark I is not that much deep behind the Mark II. They are extremely similar cameras. Give them into the hands of a competent camera photographer, and you literally have to pixel peep to tell the difference, but no one but an avid pixel peeper might be able to tell the difference between shots shot by the two cameras. I don't think anyone can tell otherwise. Even the photographer included will have to do quite a bit of thorough investigation to tell whether my photos made by R5 Mark I or II are any different. So I hope that you will be able to accept this, the R5 Mark I in year 2024, when I'm making this video, as a comparison basis for a modern camera, what a modern camera can do today. And I'm using, of course, the DxO Mark because they have a consistent camera measurements that come from the very earliest cameras, and I call 10D a very earliest camera because it is the first CMOS sensor from Canon. So this was one of the earliest digital cameras. It was released in 2003. 21-year-old, an adult camera by all manners, and it was a 6.3 megapixel camera, and was the first in the 10D line of cameras, which was succeeded by 20D, 30, 40. Now it's like the 90D. So this is the ancestor of the 90D, and it's also the ancestor of the 5D series. So after the 10D, which is an aps-c sensor, came out the 20D, and next year 2004 and 2005 came out the 5D Mark I, which is basically the 20D with a full frame sensor. So that's the 5D line. The 10D successor resized from aps-c to full frame sensor, and the 5D Mark III is the iteration of the 5D Mark I. So that's the genealogy of these cameras. And then of course the Canon R5, that's the late cousin where the mirror inside the camera was ditched. But that's not just the only difference. Of course, throughout the years the sensor technology has changed a lot, and in the R5 there's a lot more dynamic range. That is the biggest improvement, and also a lot more megapixels. And when we look at the measurements, let's look actually let's look at the dynamic range comparison between them. And you see, yellow line is the R5. Its dynamic range has tremendously improved in the low ISOs compared to the other two cameras, because as you see here, we are hitting around actual ISO 2000. Then the R5 and the 5D Mark III are virtually almost identical. So they have the same dynamic range from ISO 2000 on. There's like a tiny bit of difference, but it's really negligible. You as a photographer, how your skill is matters a lot more than this tiny amount of difference. So in the same lighting situation, if they give the 5D Mark III to a photographer who is familiar with the light, will get a much better dynamic range out of the same scenario than a person who doesn't understand light with an R5 in these scenarios. But I would say not even these, but these scenarios too, because even though we see here like a tremendous difference in dynamic range, and when we look at the 10D, which is the very early camera from 2003, aps-c sensor size, much smaller sensor than the full frame sensor of these other two, then the dynamic range is even lower for that camera, and only at ISO 100 it has like a reasonable level, and then it just gets less and less dynamic range. But what does this mean? Do we absolutely need such an astonishing dynamic range for an acceptable or even for an exceptional picture? And the answer for that is that, you see, it shows EV10. In my experience, if you have 10 stops, so it means how many stops of dynamic range. So if you have at least 10 stops of dynamic range, and you are a competent photographer, which means you have a really good skill level, then you can capture an excellent image that will look it's absolute fantastic on your computer screen. Why is that? It's because your computer screen is unable to resolve more than 10 stops of dynamic range. And provided that you have the best screens on the planet. Now, an average screen can resolve about 8 stops of dynamic range. If you have a very good screen, it resolves 9 stops. And if you have a very expensive, superb, made for photographers special screen, then we are talking about 10 stops of dynamic range. So basically, and you see the EXO mark shows the 10 stop as the green line. It shows the green line. So if it's above the green line, it means that you are getting basically a professionally acceptable level of dynamic range. And then we have here a yellow line, and if it's between green and yellow, it's kind of okay, but really nice. If it's between yellow and the red, then it's like significantly shrunk, and if it's below the red, which is 6 stops, then it's really, we are talking about severely artistic lens. So those will only work for you if you are truly an artist and you have the eye to capture the image, which means that you can play with the light and shadow so that you don't have to have like an extreme dynamic range, but you have the ability to select your framing and your lighting and everything so that it can work for you. It means that as we stop with the dynamic range, the more and more skill level you need to get an image that you will love as the person who is taking the image, and not just you but others viewing that image. And I will show you an image that I took at this setting at 1600 ISO. Actually it only shows up to 1600, but this camera goes down to 3200, so it has one more stop of ISO, but it shows really 1600 because even the 3200 ISO in the camera has the same sensor output, I believe, as the 1600, but in software it just pushes the JPEG, it pushes the output, JPEG output, one stop higher. So in the camera, technically, if you use 3200 ISO, you are using the same sensor settings to capture as at 1600, but what you see in the screen and how the camera meters your capture is like one stop lower, as if you had one more sensitivity there. And that's a trick that a lot of cameras have used, especially the early cameras before 2010. Almost in every case, that last stop of the ISO was just a software thing, and the same thing goes for ISO 50. Like here we have ISO 50 for the R5. That's like software added compared to ISO 100 in the early cameras. Nowadays cameras can do true base ISO 50, but in the early days they couldn't do that. Just 100, or in many cases like early Nikons, it was base ISO was only 200 for the cameras. So in the case of the Canon R5, as you see, we have like an extra 3 stops or so of dynamic range available at low ISOs, which means under conditions when you have strong light. And as you see, the high dynamic range only applies when we have strong light. When we have less and less light, then the dynamic range decreases. And that's not just the camera's problem, that is also because there's less light available. So if you have 10 times less light, then of course you have 10 times less dynamic range, because there's 10 times less to capture. And as you see, like starting around ISO 3-4000 and below, the cameras just drop to the same dynamic range level, because there's just that much light to capture. There's no more light. However, as we go to brighter and brighter, then the R5 starts to pull ahead, and is able to capture a lot wider dynamic range than the 5D Mark III, which is a lot older camera model, a lot older sensor technology. So basically what it tells you, that if you have an R5, a mirrorless R5, then in bright light you can have, when you take a shot, it will have a lot more detail level in the bright area, which is like really bright. Like if, for example, you take a picture where you have the sun in that photo, and you also have a dark shadow, which is like a black area, and your camera will be able to render both the shadowy areas, which is almost total darkness, and the area around the sun with a lot of differences, a lot of gradations in that image. However, when you are viewing it on the screen will be able to show you just a 10 EV, a 10 stop segment of that 14 plus EV, 14 plus stops of dynamic range. So it means you are losing 4 stops out of the 10. But if your monitor is not as good, you might be losing half of the dynamic range of your screen. And that's why it's what you see as the JPEG output of your file, that will have like 10 EV or less of that dynamic range, and your camera has to squeeze that 14 EV down to 10 EV to make it visible, or down to 8 EV to make it visible on your computer screen. And that's what happens between the RAW to JPEG conversion, whether in your camera or with Lightroom or Photoshop or DPP4, which is Canon's software, or Capture One. But part of it, what you are doing when you are changing from RAW to JPEG, is that you are also shrinking the dynamic range to a spectrum that is visible on your computer or visible on your print. And there the R5 will give you the benefit when you are using these programs, and then you can choose which are those 10 stops that you want to show, that you want to view. And that's when the knowledge of Photoshop and Lightroom comes in handy, because you can look whether I want to see the highlights more, I want to see the shadows more, or I want to expand the mid-range more, that part which is the meat of the image. Because when we take a picture, most of the information content is in the mid-range, which is called the 18% grayscale. So the 80% gray area is kind of like the meat of the image, and which is brighter, much brighter, and much darker. Those are the extreme, those are the shadows and the highlights, and you can kind of treat them as like special add-ons to your, almost like special effects that to frame your image. That's how I think about that. And if you have another way of expressing it, or your ideas about it, I really love to hear it in the comments, and I'd love to learn and see ways. And I think that's part of photography, is that we all have our own way of looking at the images, at looking at what we do, and that's what makes one photographer's output radically different from another, how they perceive and what kind of importance do they assign to parts of the image, whether like physically, like left side, like the rule of thirds, or the dynamic range or color spectrum. So coming back to these cameras, as you see, all three of them at the strong light scenario offer more than 10 stops of dynamic range, and even the 10D offers 10.8 stops, so almost 11 stops of dynamic range. So even this shows you more dynamic range, wider dynamic range than a pretty darn good monitor can offer you. And this is not just DxOMark's measurement, this was my experience as well, that it has several stops wider dynamic range than I see on my screen. And going to DPP4, I use DPP4, not Lightroom. I will tell you why I do that and why I prefer it to that in a different episode. That would be a segue now. But there, when I look at the images, I can really drastically adjust both the shadows and the highlights. So even the 10D capability, which is now a 20-plus-year-old camera, is quite superior to my pretty decent monitors that I have. They are not ultra fancy, but so now I'm looking at Dell ultra sharp monitors. That's what they are called. They are brand new and regarded as decent. Not anything special by professional photo standards, but a lot better than the cheapest average computer screens around. So that's what the numbers tell us, that even a 20-year-old digital camera has more than enough dynamic range to provide you with an excellent shot when there is good light. And now you would think is that when there is not so much good light, then that's when the new cameras make a tremendous difference. And now I made this video to show you that this is true, and it's not true either, because the low light capabilities of the cameras are, I think, are greatly exaggerated that we have nowadays. For one, I think one side, the low light capabilities of modern digital cameras are even better than I thought, or I need, or I expected them. They're absolutely amazing. They can do absolute wonders. But on the other hand, they do a lot less than I thought they would do for me. And here I'm going to show you my photos. What do I mean that they are doing less? So I think let's get rid of my picture here, and let's get rid of that one, and let's look at my photos. So first of all, I think what I want to show you is let's look at, this is Machiko, and let's look at this photo of Machiko. So I made this photo with the Canon 10D, and this is the 21-year-old camera. It's a 6-megapixel camera, and let's have a look at the shot settings. And you see, do I see, where does it show? It was shot at ISO 200. So let's see. So if we bring it up, you see here, so that's the point. So at ISO 200 it shows 10.3 stops of dynamic range. So let's get back here. So this photo has 10.3 stops of dynamic range, and I shot this with the EF85 f1.8 USM lens. So this is the Gold Ring series lens, and I shot it wide open at f1.8, and I shot this outside. So this has very good light. outdoors, sunlight, and with a lens that actually it is still used by professional photographers as a budget lens, not as good as the L series 85mm lenses, but unless you're a photographer, you can't really tell from the images. My take on it is that I do not have an L lens, an L version of the 85mm lens, and I would love to have that lens. And I used to underappreciate this lens a lot, and I thought it's a lot less capable than the L version, the L lens. And then quite recently, about a month or two ago, I learned that this is an excellent lens, and it's been my utter incompetency that made me think that this lens is a lot inferior to the L lens, and I need an L lens to take good pictures with it, and that is absolutely untrue. It turned out that I just need to adjust the white balance. I have to say though that the Canon cameras do an excellent job to pick the auto white balance pretty good, but still you need to fine-tune the white balance and in post-processing. So if you have the JPEG straight out of the camera, then it will get you a pretty good picture, but the white balance will be a little bit off. That will make you think, especially in the case of the EF85 lens, especially full open at f1.8, that it's not as good in resolution, and the micro contrast sucks. Now, when I learned to adjust the color temperature, how I did that, so instead of auto, you see in auto it's kind of not bad, but I check on color temperature and I adjust the colors, and actually I adjust it to a point that I adjust it for my screen, so I do not have a calibrated computer screen. So this means that I just adjust my photos so they match my computer monitor, because it is me who is going to view them, and I want to view them at their best. And then sliding the color sensor, I can go through extreme variations in the color temperature, and you see if you go higher in the color temperature, it gives it a more golden tone to everything, and if you go lower, it will be bluish, and it will also be a very cold color to it. And then what I do is just adjust to whatever I feel that. Here in this case I adjusted it so that Machiko, that in the picture Machiko looks most like she does in real life. So I know from experience viewing through my eyes how her colors look like, how her eye looks like, how her fur looks like, and I adjusted this photo to 5800 Kelvin so that her colors look like how she does in real life. And this is where I have to stop a little bit with my speech here, because what I have noticed is that when I'm using my DSLRs, my mirrored cameras, the 10D and the 5D Mark III and the 5D Mark I, I noticed that with them I can match the original colors, how I experience them in real life, a lot easier than I can with mirrorless cameras. With mirrorless cameras I really have to spend a lot of time to get it look like real life. It's really a battle. It can be done, but it's a long process and it takes a lot of time. And with the DSLRs just recently figured out that all I need to do is have all these settings. When you go down, you see like contrast, shadow, highlight, color tone, and saturation. Just put everything to 0 and then adjust the white balance. And so here I put the white balance to color temperature and slide the color temperature to find which is the most accurate. And this is my workflow. And then step 2 is then I changed like here, this is how it looked like, and I just added +1 to color saturation, and this is how I found that's just the fine-tuning, the icing on the cake. I would say that for the 10D, and that also includes the 20D as well, and the 5D Classic, you can leave all of these to 0, and the only thing you need to do in raw editing is just adjust your color temperature, and you are grand. You will have a really fantastic output. Up to about a few months ago, before I realized the importance of fine-tuning the color temperature, I used to adjust the color tone, highlight, shadow, contrast, color saturation, and it took me like hours. But even if I did that, I could get to satisfactory results. But in every case, it seemed like my EF85 USM lens, the gold ring lens, is just so much inferior to L lenses, and I'm never going to get to that territory. I have to buy an L lens. And then I found that just fine-tuning color temperature, I'm getting such level of micro contrast and such authentic colors that I think previously I thought it's only possible with an L lens. So let's zoom in a little bit to see what I'm talking about. And as you see, I am just absolutely blown away by the sharpness. The Canon 10D just focuses extremely well. The autofocus mechanism of that camera it's just blowing my mind away. I have to add it's auto. I'm using the single point autofocus, the center point most of the time, and it's dead accurate every single time. And it might be my Canon 5D Classic. The 5D Classic's center point single point autofocus is much worse than the 10D's center point. And it might be that my 5D Classic is just like its autofocus system is not as good as others, and it might be that my 10D is a lot better than the general 10D, but overall what I can tell you is that I prefer using the 10D with the EF85 lens. The 10D with the EF85 USM lens is absolutely amazing. So the photos I'm taking with is just absolutely mind-blowing, and I'm finding that I'm using this camera with this lens more than any other. So if I feel like I want to take photos, this is my favorite combination to reach for: 10D body with the AF85 lens. And just to see better, let's just zoom into 200%. You can see that the eye is just razor sharp, and you can see like you do like iris diagnostics on her eye, and feel the texture of the fur is just really phenomenal. And this is a 6 megapixel image, and let's zoom out. Yes, this is from where we zoomed in. So that is just how much those megapixels are worth. So this is not like a cell phone camera's megapixels, which are just absolute non-entities when you go higher in the ISO. Yes, of course, modern cell phone cameras have very high megapixel when viewed at ISO 100 level. like full daylight, but if you go like ISO 500, ISO 1000, they are effectively a 1 megapixel camera or less. And I've done a few comparisons. I do not have the latest camera cell phones myself. I have just an iPhone XR, but if I look at iPhone shots low light on Flickr and compare them to low light 10D 20D shots, the 10D 20D in texture richness just is quite a bit superior. But that's another video in itself, because there are exceptions to that. Because these modern cameras do computation, and sometimes you can see, even in low light, exceptional detail level, but that's not the detail level captured by the camera. That's the detail level created, manufactured, artificially computed by the camera, and that was not captured by the sensor. That was your camera doodling and creating artificial fakery for you, which can be really pleasing a lot of times. I'm not dissing that. It's a major feat, but I would not call it photography. It's definitively creative art, though, where the creator of the art has absolutely minimal control over the output. I love these old cameras because here I am in full control, especially in the 10D, because the 10D here, the sensor and how it processes the images, it's 100% under my control. So I think this episode is getting super duper long, and I will stop right here, and we will continue from here, and we will continue to explore how does it change when we have not so good light, but we have a much better, much newer camera. Can we still take a comparable shot with it? And my brief spoiler alert is no, you can't. An older camera, the 10D with great light, will give you this picture, which is just an absolutely fabulous picture. And I can use my 5D Mark III 6000 ISO, and it will be a great shot for a 6000 ISO, but nothing like this. It will be more like a cartoon, a modern cartoon. And let me just finish this episode with an excellent tip. And you know what? I will make that tip a separate video, because it deserves its own voice in the sea of the internet ocean. So thank you for being here on this video. I hope it has been helpful, and I really hope that I managed to demonstrate that even with the 10D, even with this ancient camera, you can capture beautiful photos. I find this photo really beautiful. I hope you did too. Bye bye.